Hello guys, my name is Nate, and today I'm going to be talking about the stain on humanity that was Joel Rifkin, the deadliest serial killer in New York history. Joel Rifkin was born to two college students on January 20th, 1959. Understandably, they were unprepared to take care of him, so they put him up for adoption. 3 weeks later, on February 14th, Bernard and Jean Rifkin leapt at the chance to adopt him, giving him his full name, Joel David Rifkin. Apparently, the entire adoption process was incredibly smooth because 3 years later, the couple would adopt their second child, Jan, in 1962. Now, Rifkin's entire upbringing was honestly terrible, but not because he was abused or anything like that. By all accounts, his family life was fairly tame. It's just kids are dicks, and seriously, do not ever ask a kid their opinion. They will actively ruin your entire day. Starting in the first grade, his fellow classmates would deem him the turtle due to his frequent slouching and weird walk. These same classmates would oftentimes exclude him from any school activities or even neighborhood games. They basically just ostracized him from any form of social interaction with his peers. Now, as time went on, the bullying didn't just stay verbal. Eventually, it got to the point where they would be pulling his pants down, stealing his money, or just physically assaulting him just for the hell of it. Academically, Joel was considered a failure. Due to his undiagnosed dyslexia and constant harassment of his peers, he found it very hard to find his footing. His dad, a member of the East Meadow School Board, would frequently rage at him due to his poor performance. It got to the point where he actually had him tested, and it was found that he had a high IQ of 128, which is only 4 points off of being basically a genius. Things did not get any better for Joel as he progressed through his primary years. His time at East Meadows High School proved to be very reminiscent of his elementary and middle school experience. Still trying to fit in, Joel would actually join the high school track team and, of course, be rewarded the name Lardass, which, looking at him, makes sense. On top of that, his teammates will oftentimes steal his clothes or even stuff his head in a toilet, flushing it, basically just giving him like a little spritz of pneumonia, but nothing too bad. The wild thing is that rather than fighting back or dropping out of the team or just, ignoring them entirely, he instead would invite them over to his house for beer and TV. His teammates would later describe him as a literal punching bag. Apparently he had some aura around him that just magnetized people to just want to assault him, which again, I have no sympathies for this mofo. He is literally a crap stain on humanity. In another attempt to try and fit in, Joel would actually join the yearbook club. Soon after, he of course had his camera stolen, but despite this, he still tried his best to get the year-end pictures published. Despite all his efforts, in the end, he was still excluded from the yearbook club party, and apparently this absolutely devastated him. According to his mom, this just crushed him and sent him into a deep depression. Wanting to cheer their child up, they gifted him a car, and again, him being him, he would soon use this to just pick up a whole bunch of sex workers and feed his eventual addiction. Him getting the car was honestly just a big old problem because all it did was act as a catalyst for his sex addiction, and would grow his sadistic fantasies to a weird point. Talking about fantasies, Joel would later say that during this point of his life, he would often fantasize about light bondage, light rape, or even two women fighting to death in a gladiator-like battle. Time, his fantasies would grow more intense and dark, and eventually get to the point where he would constantly be fantasizing about raping and stabbing women. After seeing Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy in 1972, Joel would become enamored with the idea of strangulation, and as we will see, this would become his primary MO in all of his future murders. Stunningly, Joel did manage to take a girl on a date during his time at East Meadows High. Of course, his track teammates would soon ruin this by trapping him in the gym and throwing eggs at him until he ran away. After all this bullying and torment, it's honestly no surprise that he would eventually graduate at the bottom of his class in 1977. Wanting to leave his terrible primary years behind, Joel would later enroll himself at the NASA Community College on Long Island. Here, he would frequently cut class and in the end only graduated with one course completed after an entire year there. After a short stint at community college, Joel would soon after enroll himself at the State University of Brockport in 1978. This mofo actually got a girlfriend while he was at Brockport. Of course, because of who he is, the relationship didn't go anywhere, luckily for her, and she would later describe him as being sweet, but just always depressed. Complaints and criticisms of him did not just stop at his personal relationships, but even his former employer would describe him as a total piece of work and someone that couldn't even count to 10. Now, we're going to talk about his hobbies for a quick second because these do come into play later. During his downtime, Joel would frequently daydream about being a writer, and he would write depressing poem after depressing poem for no one to read. He also was very interested in photography and horticulture, but for some weird reason, he did not pursue these for a little while down the line. And of course, last but not least, he had a big old sex addiction. Literally, it was to the point of 2 sex workers an hour, of sometimes even more than that. He had no impulse control whatsoever, which Again, go figure. Later described this stage of his life as being devoted to the streets, which is low-key kind of funny if we're being here. He called himself a hoe, but we will see that he was not a good hoe. He was a very, very bad hoe. He literally would get his money stolen by the same people using the same exact tactics that they had used before, which he just didn't learn. While all of this was going on, Joel's father was having his own problems. Due to his ongoing battle with prostate cancer, he was in constant pain and perpetually in and out of the hospital on a regular basis. At his breaking point, Joel's father would take sedatives in February 1987, and unfortunately he would die 4 days after. His father's death had a big impact on him, so much so that he was pushed into the deepest depression that he had ever been in before. On top of that, he had gone back to the streets in an effort to kind of minimize the pain that he was feeling. In August of 1987, Joel would actually be arrested for soliciting sex with an undercover cop. Weirdly enough, actually look who we're talking about, not weirdly enough, this didn't deter Joel, but instead made his lust even more insatiable. In 1988, Joel finally decided to pursue his passion of horticulture and enrolled himself at a New York State college. It was here, Jesus Christ, it was here that all the problems really started, because an intern had caught his eye. And rather than going up to her like a normal person, he instead created these intense fantasies in his head that he never let her know about. And so when she didn't reciprocate these feelings, he became enraged, and this was honestly just his breaking point. March of 1989, a point of his life where he would describe his violent fantasies as being more intense than usual, he found himself in his mom's house all alone. Getting in his car, he headed out to Manhattan's East Village looking for his first victim. Unfortunately, he would eventually settle on someone we only know today as Susie. Susie, who was heavily addicted to drugs, and after being picked up by Joel, she repeatedly asked for him to stop so she could pick up more. Arriving back at his mom's home in Long Island, they had sex, and again she would ask for more drugs. Apparently at his breaking point, Joel picked up a 2-foot-long souvenir howitzer shell and began to beat her, only stopping when he got tired. After all of this, she was still alive, and she bit his finger so bad that he still has a scar to this day. Unfortunately, he would eventually overpower her and strangle her to death. After forcing her body into a trash bag, he cleaned up and went to sleep, literally acting as if he did not kill someone 2 feet away from him. Upon waking up, he took her body down to the basement and placed her on the washer and dryer, essentially making a makeshift operating table. He then took a X-Acto knife and began to dismember her, stating that it took him back to his high school biology days, which, I'm sorry, what? During this process, he removed her teeth and cut off her fingertips to avoid identification. He then cut off her head and placed it into a paint can, while the rest of her body parts went into various trash bags. Later that night, he drove himself to New Jersey and dropped off her head and legs in the woods and her arms and torso into the East River. On March 5th, 1989, a golfer was doing his little dancey dance and unfortunately hit the ball a little too close to the woods. When he went to retrieve it, he unfortunately stumbled upon Susie's head. After waiting for more than a year, Joel finally decided that it was time for him to select his next victim, Julie Blackbird, another sex worker who he apparently chose due to her pseudo-Madonna look. With his mother again out of town, he drove them both back to his home in East Meadows. They had sex, and the next morning at around 9 a.m., he just went absolutely mad and started beating her to death with a table leg. This wasn't enough to kill her, and he ended up having to strangle her to death, as he did with Susie. One quick note about Joel is that he had a fascination with serial killers. Not like, just trying to figure out what's going on with their psychology, but more so he wanted to, replicate their murders. And one that he had a big fascination with was Ted Bundy. As he stood over Julie's body, he briefly contemplated whether or not he should emulate his favorite killer, Ted Bundy, and sexually assault her corpse. In the end, he was repulsed by the idea and just scrapped it, which, you're okay with dismemberment, but that's apparently too much for you. Okay, again, he dismembered her body, but this time he actually placed each body part in its own separate drum, and in the end, he would drop them in both the East River and Brooklyn Barge Canal. Julie's remains were actually never found, and the only reason that we know about them is because of Joel's eventual conviction and the diary that was found amongst his possessions. In April of 1991, Joel would actually open his own landscaping business in an effort to pursue his passion of horticulture. At the same time, his sex addiction was growing way too intense, so much so that it was starting to actually take over his entire life. Summer of that same year, Rifkin found himself falling behind on rent payments due to his frequent sexual exploits, And on top of that, his landscaping business was honestly not getting too much business. So he ended up having to get a few part-time jobs, one of them being at a junkyard. On July 13th, 1991, Joel picked up 31-year-old sex worker Barbara Jacobs. They went back to his home in East Meadows, had sex, and when she fell asleep, he started beating her to death with a table leg, the same one that he used on Julie Blackburn. In the end, he would have to strangle her to death as she lay there, slowly fading in and out of consciousness. At this point, Joel had grown to become a little grossed out by the dismemberment process, so he skipped it during this murder. Instead, Joel would wrap her body up in a trash bag, place her in a cardboard box, and then again into his mom's Toyota pickup truck. He then drove himself to the Hudson River where he disposed of her remains, where they were found a few hours later by some firefighters doing their own little thing. Her death was ruled to be a suicide by drug overdose, and she was buried in a nearby cemetery. On September 1st, 1991, Joel picked up 22-year-old Mary DeLuca in Queens, New York. Eventually, they stopped at a hotel and had sex. At some point during this process, he apparently asked her, "Do you want to die?" which this is only his account, so we have no clue what she actually said, but according to him, she said yes, and so he began to strangle her. During the strangulation, according to him, she just sat there and did nothing, which he would later claim made this murder one of the weirdest ones. At this point, Joel found himself with a big old problem. He had just killed someone at a public location rather than his home base, completely out of his comfort zone. So, he went out, purchased a steamer truck, stuffed her body into it, and then drove all the way to upstate New York where he disposed of her remains. Her body was found on October 1st of that same year, with decomposition making it totally impossible to identify her until 1993. On another September night, Joel picked up Yoon Lee, a Korean native, someone who he had actually met with previously. Note, Joel had actually met with a sex worker before he had met with Yoon Lee, so he was kind of, tapped out. And so when they attempted to initiate sex, he couldn't get it up. And after a little while, apparently embarrassed, he just lunged at her and began to strangle her. And during this process, she just mouthed the words, "This was a big mistake." Astonishingly, Joel actually felt some remorse for this murder. He would later admit that he had actually had a small, weird crush on Yoon. Stuffing her in the same trunk he used for Mary DeLuca, he dropped her body in the East River, where she was found on September 23rd. Joel Rifkin's sixth victim, who to this day remains unknown, was picked up a few days prior to Christmas of 1991. They drove to an abandoned parking lot where she attempted to perform oral, but while she was doing this, Joel just started to strangle her. Then drove all the way back to his home in East Meadows with her sitting in the passenger seat dead, and he placed her inside of a 55-gallon drum that he had gotten from his part-time job at the junkyard. He then brought it back to the East River where he attempted to drop it but was actually stopped by 2 officers. Now, these cops would stop him because they thought he was illegally dumping, and somehow he was actually able to talk himself out of this, explaining that rather than dumping stuff, he was actually picking stuff up, and he was let go with a minor warning. Imagine if you were the cops that let this dude go. Jesus Christ, y'all must feel bad if you're still alive. Jeez Louise. Excited with the new simplicity of disposal, Joel would actually go ahead and purchase quite a few more drums, which he would use in all his future murders. Between December 1991 and February 1992, Joel Rifkin committed 4 additional murders, 2 of whom were identified as Lorraine Orvieto and Mary Ann Holloman. The 2 remaining victims were considered Jane Doe, and out of those 2, only 1 set of remains were able to be recovered. For these murders, Joel would continue on with his primary MO, strangulation after sex, or sex while you strangle them. It would all end up with him strangling them to death because, he's a terrible human being. Between April 1992 and November 1992, Rifkin committed 5 more murders. Their names were Iris Sanchez, Anna Lopez, Violet O'Neill, Mary Catherine Williams, and Jenny Soto. Out of these murders, Violet and Jenny's truly stuck out. In Violet's case, Joel greatly deviated from his new process of murdering in public places, and instead took her back to his home in East Meadows, something of which he had not done for over a year. On top of this, I had actually previously mentioned that he was slowly becoming disgusted with the process of dismemberment, but for some odd reason, he chose to do it in this murder. It's almost as if he was starting to get bored with these murders, and in an effort to replicate the feelings from his first one, started to revert back to his previous tactics. Jenny Soto, his final victim of 1992, was picked up in Lower Manhattan on November 16th. Now she put up a fight, God bless her. She fought to the final moment. Rifkin would later describe this being the most difficult murder because she would actually break all 10 of her fingernails as she tried fighting the sadistic prick off. In the end, her body was dumped in the Hudson River and was found the very next day. Originally, the cops were pointing their scopes at her ex-con boyfriend, but fortunately they eventually dropped it. Left with scars that painted his face and body, Soto's murder proved to be just a wee bit too much for him, and he took a 15-week break. Joel's other victims, Anna, Mary, and Iris, had their bodies pretty much dumped in plain sight, with Iris's body literally being placed under a mattress next to JFK Airport. Thing is, her body was not found for the hottest of hot minutes. No one suspected a thing. Literally, people were just walking by, nope, no smell, nothing. Which, how? Joel's first victim of 1993 was Leah Evans, who he had picked up on February 27th. They drove to an abandoned parking lot where he began to try and initiate sex, but Leah had asked for a little bit more privacy. When Joel denied her, she began to cry, and as she started to cry, Joel lunged at her and began to strangle her to death. In a complete deviation from his new process, he actually would end up driving Leah all the way to far out East Long Island, where he would bury her in a shallow grave. She was the only victim he had actually done this for, which in my mind almost looks as some form of sympathy for her crime. Okay, honestly, I take that back. I doubt that it was sympathy. Looking at who this dude was, he was probably just trying to do something a little different, if we're being honest. A few weeks later, Joel would end up murdering Lauren Marquez. Now, Lauren fought hard as hell, so much so that Joel could literally not strangle her. It got so bad that he ended up just breaking her neck. Tiffany Breshani's murder would be Joel's last, and with the weird way that he handled it, it would eventually lead to his eventual capture. On June 24th, 1993, Joel picked up Tiffany and drove her to an abandoned parking lot where he strangled her to death. From there, he drove back to his mom's house in East Meadow, on the way picking up various items such as duct tape, tarp, just the normal serial killer items. By the time he got back home, her body was now placed in the trunk and wrapped up in tarp and duct tape. At the same time that he arrived back at his mom's house, she came out demanding her keys so that she could go on a grocery trip. For an entire hour, his mom was out shopping with Tiffany's body in the back of the trunk, and she knew nothing. I don't understand how these people are not smelling, like how the decomposition process has not taken full force yet. It's absolutely baffling. When his mom got home, he quickly moved Tiffany's body from the car into the garage, which was well known to be off limits to all others except Joel. And for some weird, dumb Joel Rifkin reason, he ended up working on his car for 3 days. Eventually, in his very, very busy schedule, Joel finally found time to dispose of her body, and he was found in the very same way that his idol, Ted Bundy, was found.
Approximately 3:15 in the morning, we observed a pickup truck in the center lane. As we got closer, we realized there was no license plate. We turned on the lights to initiate a car stop. The pickup truck did not pull over. We pulled up alongside of him. He just kind of slowly looked over, had a very blank look on his face. Possibly he was intoxicated, so I pointed to him to pull over to the side of the road. We thought he was pulling up onto the shoulder, at which time he exited the Southern State Parkway. He just wasn't stopping. And at that point, I called in that we were in pursuit. He was getting faster and faster, up to 90 miles an hour. We started getting into tighter, windier roads. We stayed right behind him. There's clearly something he's hiding. He was debating which way to turn. At the last minute, he decided to go left. He drove up onto the sidewalk and struck a light pole, knocking down the pole, and the pursuit was over. I approached white male subject with his hands up. I opened the door, grabbed him out, and put the cuffs on him. I asked him his name, his address, date of birth. He said his name was Joel Rifkin. And that's when I noticed the smell. As we looked into the back of the truck, there was a blue tarp. The decision was made to pull back the tarp. We could see the head and shoulder of a female deceased for several days.
In the end, Joel Rifkin would admit to 17 murders. He went into meticulous detail about the name and ways he murdered his victims. The cops, given all this information, were able to link him with murders, many of which had been previously unknown. During his trial, this mofo had the audacity to try and plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Fortunate enough, the juror saw straight through this and would convict him of 203 years in prison for 9 murders. Now, you're probably asking why it was only 9 when he admitted to 17, and honestly, it was just to ensure that they could get him into prison for the rest of his life. As you begin to add more charges on top of charges, it kind of gets muddy and it makes prosecution just a little bit more difficult. Today, Joel David Rifkin is still alive and serving out his 203-year sentence in Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. The fact that he was able to get away with 17 murders is absolutely disgusting, and this case clearly shows the lack of sympathy and empathy for sex workers and the brutality that they have to go through on a regular basis. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this content, please leave a comment and let me know. Let me know what else you'd like to see. If you really like it, hit that like button, and if you want to see more of my face, please hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Bye.